Happy Hanukkah to everyone. We're starting Hanukkah tonight. I'd like to, in a moment, talk about Hanukkah and about the Parsha. But before I do, we woke up this morning to some terrible news from Australia. There was an attack there. I guess some of you have not yet seen the news. And so I just want to respond. Unfortunately, we're living in a time of growing anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence. I think it's been increasingly growing in recent years. There's no denial of that. And it's something that we have to be aware of. We have to ask our fellow non-Jews to stand up, take a side, because sitting back and doing nothing is not an answer. But for ourselves, for us, we also need to be certain that we don't stand down, because the worst thing that we can do as Jews is to hide, to disappear. That's what they would like us to do. They would like us to disappear. They would like us to hide, and then they'll continue trying to find us. So our solution is to stand up for ourselves, stand strong, stand proud, and then demand that our non-Jewish neighbors and friends all stand with us. So for that reason, at the same time, we do have to be very careful about security. It's very unfortunate that right now, every Jewish community, security has become a very significant part of their budget. Thankfully, our community has been very supportive till now, and we've been able to pay for full-time guards and armed guards here at the center and at events that we do. Not every Jewish community is that fortunate. A lot of them struggle, but it's unfortunate to be aware that we're planning our big Hanukkah event of the year in Hermosa Beach, which I think has been, since we started about 10 years ago, and since we started it by far, each year we fill up that whole Hermosa Pier Plaza with Jewish music and lighting the menorah, and it's really an amazing experience. And understandably, people are concerned because it's an open event. It's out in the public. So firstly, we are going to have very, very strong security presence. We are working with the Hermosa Beach Police Department since early this morning. They are going to be there. They said already starting at 10 a.m. They're going to have a very strong presence, and they're bringing everyone they can down there to secure the area, the venue. But we're not going to cancel, because we would never let them do that to us. And I think it's really important that despite I don't think it's a very high level danger. The risks are still fairly low, to be realistic. But it's not safe. Every time you go to a shul or go to a Jewish event today, unfortunately, there is a certain risk because of the increased violence. But as Jews, while we don't deny that risk, and we have to take whatever steps we can to mitigate it, as Jews, we also are not going to be afraid of it. Because if we start being afraid and say, I'm not going to go to shul, I'm not going to go to an event, or put my kids in a Jewish school because I'm afraid of being openly Jewish, then we're letting them win, and we're not going to let them win. In a couple of weeks, I am planning a class which I've been working on for a very long time. On anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, and we'll talk about a lot more about it then. We will win this battle. We will win the battle for the heart of civilization, to be supportive of Jews, and for that matter, any people that want to just live in peace, and put an end to the hatred and the violence. I believe we will eventually, but if we step back and we try to hide, then that's going to make it a lot harder for us to win. So we need to, soldiers go to the battlefield, go on the front lines to protect their country, whether it's the United States, whether it's Israel, whether it's other countries, right? They put their lives on the line to protect their country. Police officers every day are out there in our communities and other places, putting their life on the lines to protect other people. It's sad that we have to say this, but it's a reality, and I think we need to, as Jews, we are prepared. The risk is low, to be clear. It's very low. Your chances of being hurt at a shul today, there's been a handful of attacks over the last couple of years, right? So your chances are still extremely low statistically. So it's important to mention that. But there is a risk, and we Jews are going to stand up. We're going to be soldiers. We're going to fight on. We're not going to, avoid going to Jewish things or being Jewish or being publicly Jewish just because they threaten us and just because they say they're going to harm us. No, we're going to stand strong. And if it comes with, and we'll try to mitigate the risk in whatever way we can, but if it comes with some risk, we need to be prepared for that because we're not going to give in. So I think that's just a few words just to open with. And so tonight, I hope to see you all there, even if you were not planning on going or had other plans. I think given what happened, I think it's more important than ever that our community make a stand today in Hermosa Beach. So I hope you will all be there in Hermosa Beach at 3:30. Anyone who's able to volunteer would be greatly appreciated. Some of you have already volunteered. And reach out to your friends and neighbors, even non-Jews. I think it's important that every neighbor of yours, every friend of yours who's not Jewish needs to take a stand where they stand. Do they support the Jewish community despite all the threats that we're facing, or are they going to just stay silent and and ignore it all? And they need to take a stand. And silence itself is silence means that you're acquiescing to it. You're okay with it. So I think we should encourage our non-Jewish friends also, your neighbors, bring everyone you can, and we will make a strong showing today for the Jewish community. With that said, let's get, we have a lot to cover today. I'll talk quickly about Hanukkah, the Parsha, which is a fascinating, well, let me first start with the Parsha. I'll get to Hanukkah, and then we will get to our fascinating topic today, which I'm very excited about. Some of you also told me you're very excited about Bet Shamai and Bet Hillel. So let's start with the Parsha. This week's Parsha is Miketz. We ended off last week on a cliffhanger where Joseph, who had been sold by his brothers as a slave when he was 17 years old, has spent a number of years as a slave in a fellow called Potiphar's home. He was accused falsely by Potiphar's wife of rape after he refused her advances, and he was therefore thrown into a pit. There in a prison. There in the prison, he met the king's baker and butler. He successfully interpreted their dreams. He asked the winemaker when he is restored to Pharaoh's palace, to his position as winemaker, he should mention him before Pharaoh. The winemaker forgot about him. So this week's parsha opened where fast forward 2 years, Pharaoh has a dream, two very strange dreams. In one dream, he sees 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows standing next to the Nile, and then the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat cows, and it's not visible. They don't get any bigger as a result. Then there is a stalk of grain that has a stalk of wheat that has ears, which are these things that come out of the wheat that the kernels grow on. It has 7 healthy ears of grain, and then 7 very skinny, parched ears of grain, of wheat. And the 7 skinny ears eat up the 7 fat ears of wheat. And he wakes up in the morning, Pharaoh, and he's looking for an interpreter, and nobody's able to give him a satisfactory interpretation to his dream. So it is then the winemaker goes to Pharaoh and says, well, when I sinned to Pharaoh and I was thrown in prison, there was this Hebrew boy that knew how to interpret my dream, mine and the baker's, and exactly as he interpreted, that's exactly what happened. So Pharaoh orders Joseph be brought before him. Joseph is cleaned up and brought before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him his dream, and Joseph tells him the meaning of your dream. He says, firstly, it's not me, it's all Hashem, it's all up to Hashem. We spoke about that last week. I don't interpret dreams. Hashem gives us the interpretation. And then he goes ahead and interprets Pharaoh's dream, telling him there will be 7 years of plenty in the land of Egypt, and then afterwards there will be 7 years of famine in the land of Egypt. And the famine will be so severe that it will swallow up the years of plenty, in the sense that you will forget about the plenty, the 7 years of plenty. And the reason why the dream is twice is because it's going to happen very soon. However, Joseph then adds, God is telling you this because you have a solution. What you can do is, during the 7 years of plenty, you should gather grain and store the grain, and that grain will then be there for the 7 years of famine. So Pharaoh is very impressed, and he says, is there anyone as wise as you? I appoint you as leader of Egypt. So he appoints Joseph as second to the king, where he's going to manage the entire country, and Pharaoh will only be on top of him with the ability to overrule him, but Joseph will manage the day-to-day affairs. Joseph then gets married to an Egyptian woman called Asnat, which according to Rashi and the Midrashim is the daughter of Potiphar, his former boss or slave owner, and perhaps the daughter of his the woman who threw him into prison to start with. We don't know. And they have 2 children. Meanwhile, there are 7 years of plenty. During these 7 years of plenty, Joseph collects a lot of grain and stores in the storehouses all over Egypt. And then then the 7 years of famine begin, and the Egyptians all come to Joseph for grain, and he gives out grain to all the Egyptians. The famine is not only in Egypt, but also in the land of Canaan, where Jacob and his family are living. By now, his family has grown. They have become a whole tribe. Each of his children are married. They all have their own children. Some of them already have grandchildren, and they're all living kind of in a family compound together, and all living together. And Jacob tells his children, go down to Egypt to find grain. He sends only 10 of his sons. The 11th, Joseph, of course, is not there. The youngest son, Benjamin, who is an adult. He's now 30 years old, and he is a father of 10. But Jacob does not send him. His brother died. His mother died. He didn't want to take any chances with Benjamin. And so the 10 brothers come down to Egypt. They stand before Joseph. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so he begins to accuse them of being spies. He says, you came to spy out the land. And they say, no, we are honest. We are 12 brothers. One brother disappeared, and one brother is back with our father in the land of Canaan. So Joseph tells them, if you are telling the truth, the way you will prove that your story is true, is go back and bring your brother from Canaan that you say is still there. And so he sells them grain. He puts all their money back in the sacks that they paid for the grain, back in the sacks of grain that he gave them. And they come back, and when they get back to the land of Canaan, they tell their father what happened, and their father is very upset. He does not want to send Benjamin down to Egypt, and and when they open their sacks of grain, they see that their money is in their sacks, and they think that it is a plant that was planted there in order to accuse them, in order to in order to punish them. So they don't end up going back to Egypt just yet. They wait till all the grain is completed, and Jacob says, go back to Egypt, get us more grain. They said, we cannot go without Benjamin. Jacob doesn't want to send Benjamin, and his son Judah guarantees that he would make sure that Benjamin comes back. They go down to Egypt. Over there in Egypt, Joseph is happy to see them. He invites them for lunch. They eat. They prepare a gift. They bring a gift for him. They prepare a gift. They tell the person in charge of his house about the money in their sacks. The person says, don't worry about it. We got the money. No, it's yours to keep. God must have given you a gift. And they sit and they eat lunch with Joseph, and everything is fine, and he gives them grain. And then Joseph tells the person, one of his people, to hide his magical silver goblet that he uses to divine in Benjamin's bag. And they leave Egypt. They don't get very far out, and Joseph's men surround them and say someone stole the master's goblet. And so they go through all the bags, and sure enough, they find the goblet in Benjamin's bag. They take them back to Joseph with them. They take Benjamin back to Joseph. They say he's going to be a slave for the rest of his life as a punishment. And all the brothers follow Benjamin back to Joseph. And that's where the Parsha ends. And to hear the rest of the story, you have to wait till next week.
She said they have big problems.
Sorry?
Susan said they had their problems.
They had their problems. Oh, yes. It's a great story, the story of Joseph. Greatest drama, I think, in the Torah. Tonight that's the story of Parsha Miketz. Tonight is the first night of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, we celebrate, just briefly, we've done some classes on Hanukkah. Hanukkah, we celebrate in the days that the Greeks Syrian Greeks controlled the land of Israel, and they had banned Jewish practice and forcibly Hellenized, or tried to make Jews adopt the Greek culture, and they turned the temple into an idolatrous temple, and there was a band of Jews led by Matityahu, the Hashmonai, and along with his sons, and they fought back a guerrilla war, and they managed to miraculously, although they were few, and not well trained, they managed to beat back the Greek armies, chase them out of the land of Israel. They came to the holy temple that had been turned into an idolatrous temple. They restored it, and when they were ready to restart the service, there was no oil to light. They only found one jug of clean, pure oil, and it miraculously lit for 8 days, and therefore we celebrate an 8-day festival of Hanukkah. We celebrate Hanukkah primarily we add a prayer in the Shemona Esrei. We say the Hallel prayers every day, so we add a little bit to our prayers. But the primary celebration of Hanukkah is that every night of Hanukkah, we light the menorah. That is the mitzvah of Hanukkah. On the first night of Hanukkah, we light one candle. We use a shamash, an additional candle, to light the first candle, so it's one plus the shamash, and then each night we add a candle. We light, the candles could be lit out of anything you like, but the ideal is to use olive oil, which is what they used back in the temple. In our store, we sell these kind of kits that have these little bottles with oil with wicks that you can light each night, and you get enough candles for the whole Hanukkah. But whichever it is, it's important to light the Hanukkah menorah every night. The Ashkenazi custom is that everyone in the household lights the Hanukkah menorah. Sephardim just light one per household. And so we light the menorah after sundown. Sundown today is about 4:45 p.m. So we light after sundown. You can light before sundown if necessary, from about an hour or so before sundown. So you can light from about 3:45, and sundown is to be exact 4:46. But ideally you should light after sundown, after 4:45, ideally, it should burn long enough that it burns for a full half hour after it gets dark. So it's usually dark about 30 minutes after sundown, and it should burn for another 30 minutes after that. If you light late, once it's already fully dark at about 5:15, then you only need a candle that burns 30 minutes. If you light earlier, you should get bigger candles. Some of those cheap candles that they sell don't last very long, so you should make sure your candles last long enough. So that's the main mitzvah of Hanukkah. We have lots of additional customs of Hanukkah where we eat oily foods, latkes, donuts. There's also a custom of eating dairy foods on Hanukkah. If you dip your latkes in sour cream, you've done both. And there's a recent Ashkenazi custom of playing dreidel. We did a class on dreidel, I think, last year in honor of Hanukkah. So that is the story of Hanukkah in short. The Rebbe encouraged that given the challenges that American Jewry face today with assimilation, and given that Hanukkah is always around the American Christian holiday season, and given that Hanukkah was always a public Jewish festival where we lit the Hanukkah in public, in the open, the Rebbe encouraged that we do large Hanukkah events to help build Jewish pride, to counter assimilation, and and we're doing one tonight. We mentioned in Hermosa Beach. We're going to be doing a number of such events throughout Hanukkah. I encourage you to join these events, especially given what happened. We'll stand up. That way we show our Jewish pride, having these public Hanukkah events. We do them in each city in the South Bay, so that every city kind of wants to do its own event. And we also, I should mention, need volunteers for all these events. So if anyone's able to volunteer at any of them, please do let me know. Any questions?
Did you say it was 3:30 on the pier?
3:30 Hermosa Beach Pier, yes. Any questions? All right, well, let's get straight to our topic then for today. As we'll see in a moment, it's a little connected to Hanukkah. Fascinating topic. I know it's already late, so we might go a little over time, just a heads up, but we'll do it as cover. I want to cover everything. Hopefully not too much overtime. So the Talmud in the book of Shabbos tells us about the laws of Hanukkah and about lighting the menorah. And when it tells us about lighting the menorah, the Talmud brings two different opinions as to how we should light the menorah. Bet Shammai, the school of Shammai, say that the first night of Hanukkah, you should light 8 candles. And then the second night, you should light 7 candles. Every night, lighting 1 candle less. On the 8th night, you light 1 candle. Bet Hillel, the school of Hillel, say no. On the first night, you should light 1 candle. On the second night, you should light 2 candles. The third night, 3 candles. Every night, you should add a candle. We, of course, follow the second view, the view of Bet Hillel. But who are Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel? Why did they disagree? And why do we follow Bet Hillel? So that's what we're going to try to address today. So Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel were 2 major schools of Jewish study or academies in Jerusalem that lasted for about 100 years during what we could call the late Second Temple period, for about the last 100 years before the destruction of the temple, from about 30 BCE till about the year 70. The schools were founded by 2 great Jewish leaders in around the year 30 BCE. Shammai, the sages Shamai and Hillel. Bet Shammai means the school of Shammai. Bet Hillel means the school of Hillel. Now, these 2 schools disagreed on countless laws throughout the Mishnah, in fact, and the Talmud. In fact, we have recorded in the Mishnah and Talmud 316 disagreements between these 2 schools that cover virtually every part of Jewish law. In almost all those disagreements, we follow the view of Bet Hillel. So how did these schools start? Where did they come from? Why did they have so many disagreements? And why do we follow, most of the time, do we follow Bet Hillel? So before I answer those questions, just a quick note or disclaimer. I'm going to try to do the best that I can to tell the story of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel based on my own studies in the past and recent research and preparation for this class. But we have very little written record from what we could call the early Roman or the Herodian Jewish period. So this period going from about 30 BCE till about the year 70 is the first 100 years of the Roman Empire, when it moved from a republic. Around that time was when it moved from a republic to an empire. It was right at the kind of the early Roman period. At the time in Israel, it's known as the Herodian period because it's when Herod the Great was leader of Israel, was king of Israel, and later his children, and then later the Romans are leaders of Israel during this period. Our primary historical source for this period are the works of Josephus. Josephus's accuracy, I hope to do one day a class on Josephus. His accuracy, though, is problematic. Historians today, based on how much he could be trusted. He primarily focuses on the politics, the politics between Roman Greeks and Jews, political leadership. He doesn't really speak about Judaism and Jewish leadership. He's mostly speaking about politics. In passing, he does speak about religious leadership and religious structures, but he mentions them only in passing. And he's writing for the Romans, who don't really understand Jewish political structure and Jewish religion and Judaism. And so it's hard to know, especially in the kind of information, how much of what he writes is exact. In addition to Josephus, we have countless anecdotes, hundreds of anecdotes found in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in the Midrashim about this period. But it's very hard to piece them together. It's essentially putting together a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000-piece puzzle when you only have 50 or 100 pieces. Right? It's a very, very hard thing to do. We have lots and lots of anecdotes recorded in the laws. The Talmud and Mishnah are primarily laws, but we have lots of small anecdotes about that period, but they're all very small. So it's very hard to piece together exactly what happened. As a result, the accounts in history books about the Jewish religious life in this period are really all over the place. So every history book you open will tell you a somewhat different story. So what I'm going to share is mostly based on the book Dorot HaRishonim by Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, who was printed about 150 years ago. I think it's widely considered the best work of this period, as well as Toldot HaTanaim VaAmoraim by Aaron Hyman, who mostly built on Halevi's work of Jewish history. So here's the story. The Jewish people were historically led, religiously at least, by a Sanhedrin, a supreme council. We believe that the supreme council, the Sanhedrin, goes back. Sanhedrin itself is a Greek name that was used during the Greek period of Israel, but it was previously called Bet Din Hagadol, the Great Court, and it was established originally in the days of Moses. We believe it continued throughout the biblical period. It's not explicitly mentioned anywhere in Scripture after Moses, although there is alluded to in a couple places. During the beginning of the Second Temple, the biblical period lasted for about 1,000 years after Moses. Remember, Moses 3,300 years ago. During the beginning of the Second Temple period, the Sanhedrin was expanded and became known as the Knesset Hagadola, the Great Assembly. We once did a class where we spoke about the Great Assembly and its impact on Judaism. Throughout the Second Temple period, the Sanhedrin continued and led Israel from Jerusalem. Its seat was in the Holy Temple. So it was right next to the main courtyard of the Holy Temple was a big room called the Lishkat Hagazit, the room of cut stone, and that was the home of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin itself consisted of 284 scholars, 71 senior scholars who had voting rights, who were allowed to vote, and another 213 junior scholars. It seems that there were many more kind of non-members that would partake in the Sanhedrin. In other words, the numbers of students are not necessarily always exact. It may have, that was kind of general, but it seems to have fluctuated a little bit, and there would be many students or young budding scholars that would partake in discussions. So it was more than a court, it was more than a council. It was primarily maybe the way our founders visualized, expected the Senate to look, or the way the Roman Senate was. It was primarily an academy. And when we say academy, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi differentiates between a yeshiva and what he calls a metifta, or an academy. A school is a place where students go to study, right? An academy is a place where scholars spend their lives studying and debating. So it wasn't just a school where people were going to study, young people were going to kind of get their formative education. It was for people who were already very, very well educated, very knowledgeable, already great recognized scholars who would spend their days studying and debating issues in this academy. So that's what the Sanhedrin essentially was, with the power, with a council that would vote on issues. So essentially they would debate an issue would come up, they would debate it, and then at the end of the debate, they would have a vote, and when they had the vote, that vote then became the law. That was then the binding law, that was the law of Judaism. So the Sanhedrin continues peacefully for about 200 years until the Syrian Greeks banned Jewish practice in the days when the Syrian Greeks banned all Judaism. At that time, the Greeks killed Yossi ben Yoezer, the president of the Sanhedrin, and forced all the leadership of all the members of the Sanhedrin to go into hiding. That lasted for about 3 years, and after 3 years, the Hashmonaim defeated the Greeks. It was a very short period. Thankfully, they defeated the Greeks. Israel becomes independent again, and they restore the Sanhedrin. And while the Hashmonaim themselves essentially take the civil leadership to themselves, they're from a priestly family. They're Kohanim. They become Kohen Gadol, the high priest, leading the temple service. They also take the role of essentially leader, of civil leader of Israel. Eventually, the Hashmonaim would declare themselves kings of Israel. But as civil leaders, they're in charge of running the government, collecting taxes for the government. But the Sanhedrin remains in charge of Jewish law. So all civil disputes is an issue for Jewish law. Marriages, divorces, family issues, all issues for Jewish law, right? Any financial things, trusts, family trusts, trusts for orphans and the like, all part of Jewish law. Redistribution of wealth. In other words, taking social programs, to which we had school systems, social programs to support the poor. All those were part of, under the purview of the Sanhedrin, of the Supreme Council. They weren't under the control of the king, of the leader. The leader controlled the army, built, maybe built infrastructure, kept the peace. But they were not in charge of the day-to-day life of Jews was through taxes paid to the Sanhedrin, through money collected by the Sanhedrin, rulings given by the Sanhedrin. The day-to-day Jewish life was more controlled by the Sanhedrin, the religious leadership, than the Hashmonaim, the kings. So under Hashmonai rule, the Sanhedrin functioned most of the time. Some of the Hashmonaim were benevolent rulers. There were a handful of times under the close to 100 years of Hashmonai rule that there are disputes between the Hashmonai leader and the religious leadership. A few times the Hashmonai leader disbands the Sanhedrin, even kills religious leadership, notably King Yanai, who kills the religious leadership, or sends most of them into hiding. And so there are times where the Sanhedrin is due to kind of friction with the Hashmonai leadership. The Sanhedrin is forced to go into hiding, but most of this period they function. Towards the end of the Hashmonai lead period, there are two brothers, sons of King Yanai, called Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And both brothers fight for control of Israel. Each one wants to be king. And they have this big civil war between the two of them. And then eventually both sides turn to Pompey, the Roman general who had just conquered the land of Syria, and from which had been Greek. They defeated the Greeks. The Greek Syrian Empire is gone. It's now part of the ever-growing Roman Empire. And so he's just to the north of Israel. And so both brothers turn to Pompey and ask him to help them secure the land of Israel and get rid of their brother. Pompey marches on Jerusalem with that invitation. He captures Jerusalem easily, and he then calls both brothers, and he decides to give the leadership to Hyrcanus, makes Hyrcanus the king and high priest, and he arrests Aristobulus and takes him and his family and takes them back to Rome with him. Aristobulus' son, though, Alexander, manages to escape, and he flees to Egypt, and he raises an army to reclaim Jerusalem, and he captures Jerusalem back from, remember, Egypt is still under Greek rule. It's not yet under Roman rule. Right? Pompey is soon going to end up capturing Egypt, but not yet. So he marches on Jerusalem, captures Jerusalem, and declares himself king. Hyrcanus is forced to flee. Hyrcanus reaches out to the Romans for help, and the Roman general Gabinus, who is the general stationed in Syria, marches with his army down to Jerusalem. He recaptures Jerusalem and reinstalls Hyrcanus as leader. But now, Hyrcanus, who had been put in place by the Romans, so would have still been answerable to the Romans. Now the Romans are not going to just leave Hyrcanus there, but they leave a very strong garrison of Romans in Jerusalem to keep the Egyptian or anyone allied with the Egyptians out of Jerusalem and out of Israel. And they also leave a Roman governor to govern Israel alongside Hyrcanus. And they decide that they're not going to allow, they want Roman control. Hyrcanus is going to be king in name only. They want Roman control over the land of Israel, ostensibly to protect the land of Israel from further invasions. As part of this, they also are not, Gabinus is not happy that the Sanhedrin, this Jewish council, is managing Jewish life in the land of Israel because they're in charge of Judaism and most things fall under their control. And so he goes ahead and disbands the Sanhedrin. He wasn't killing the Sanhedrin, members of the Sanhedrin, as the Greeks had done, or as some of the Hasmoneans had done. He just disbands it. He doesn't want another central authority other than Hyrcanus and the Roman governor. He allows for regional Sanhedrins and allows them to create 5 regional Sanhedrins around the land of Israel, kind of to have different centers of power. He's okay with that, and they can manage Jewish life in each region, but he doesn't want a centralized Sanhedrin. So as a result, the Sanhedrin is disbanded. There is, though, still what we could call a rump Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin has some very important roles. Besides deciding Jewish law, one of the most important roles of the Sanhedrin is setting the calendar. Before we created a long-term calendar, which I believe we once did a class on. Before creating our calendar that we have today, the Sanhedrin would set the new month every single month, would declare a new month. Some months with 29 days, some months with 30 days, the Sanhedrin month by month decided. So you needed a Sanhedrin every month. The Sanhedrin couldn't disappear. So they retained what we could call a rump Sanhedrin, a minimal Sanhedrin which had a handful of members, didn't have the normal 284 members, but had a handful of members, and they were still declaring the calendar, creating the calendar month by month. But and that was led by members, we don't know their names, but members of the Betera family. The Betera family, B'nai Betera, were one of the prominent families in Jerusalem, and they produced many scholars, and some members of their family became leaders of this Sanhedrin. It seems around this time, the 2 previous leaders of the Sanhedrin, Shamai and Avtalio, who were forced to resign when the Sanhedrin is disbanded. These 2 leaders die soon after. They're very old at the time. They both die soon after. And the B'nai Betera lead this kind of basic Sanhedrin that the Romans allow. But the academy with the academy with the council with 284 or so members, that essentially is disbanded. So it appears that it's at this point, in the days of Hyrcanus, when the Sanhedrin is disbanded, that one of the former leaders of the Sanhedrin, one of the leading scholars of the Sanhedrin, by the name of Shammai, decides to create his own private yeshiva, or really his own private academy, with other leading members of the Sanhedrin in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Romans had no problem with studying Torah at this point. They have no problem with Jewish scholars having a private academy. Their problem was only with a centralized Sanhedrin. So they're okay with that, and Shammai builds this private academy in Jerusalem, and many of Shammai's colleagues and his students gather in this academy. It would have been privately funded. They probably had to raise money for it to fund it, and they have this private academy that is studying in Jerusalem. And it grows, it becomes very prominent within their own school. They have debates. They can't really vote on things and make it binding on all of Israel because they're not a Sanhedrin, but they have debates and they come to decisions on their own, or create consensus among themselves about certain laws, and they're studying and analyzing and applying laws over time. Now, at the same time, The Romans over time step back, become less concerned about other Jewish centers of power within the land of Israel. The land of Israel becomes more secured under Hyrcanus's reign, at least for some time. And so over time, the original Rump Sanhedrin grows, becomes more of an official institution. However, Shammai's school remains the largest yeshiva in Jerusalem. Now, Hillel was a Babylonian Jew from Babylon. In fact, he was a very prominent Babylonian Jew because he was from the family, perhaps his father was even the Reish Geluta, the prince of the exile. We've done a class before where we spoke about Babylonian Jewry, and we spoke about how Babylonian Jews for some 1,500 years had a Reish Geluta, a prince of the exile, a person whose role it was essentially was the political leader of Jews in Babylon. They were descendants of the house of David, so they were kind of part of the Jewish royal family, and they were the recognized Jewish political leader in Babylon. So it was the most prominent Jewish family in Babylon. Hillel is from that family. As a very young man, probably in his teens, he traveled from Babylon to Israel, where he studied under the great Rabbi Yehoshua ben Prachia, who was the president of the Sanhedrin at the time. This is kind of going way back. And then he returns to Babylon as a young man. He goes into business, the family business, it seems, and he does that till he's about 40 years old. At the age of 40, he quit his business, quit his job, and he decides that he wants to study Torah full-time. His family's really upset about it, but he moves with his extended family, that is, he moves with his wife and children to the land of Israel, where he joins the Academy of and Sanhedrin of Shamai and Avtalyon, and becomes one of the budding scholars there, one of the leading scholars there in the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. When the Sanhedrin is disbanded, he makes his way back to Babylon, where in Babylon he's now an older man, he's recognized as a leading sage. Some years later, Hyrcanus is deposed, but then eventually the Persians come for a little bit. There's a lot of violence in Israel during this period, but eventually the Romans come back, led by Herod, whose father Antipater had been a servant of the king Hyrcanus. And he had been a very powerful servant, and Herod had convinced the Romans to allow him to recapture the land of Israel from the Persians, and he does so, and the Romans declare him as king of Israel. After Herod becomes king of Israel, Israel seems to be more stable. At the time, Herod was a horrible tyrant, but he allowed, at least at this point, the Sanhedrin to function. And so Hillel returns to the land of Israel, we believe in the year 30 BCE. As soon as Hillel comes back to the land of Israel, he's already an older man now. He is quickly recognized as the greatest Torah scholar of his day. And it's at this point, we did a class once on Hillel where we spoke about his story much, much more in detail, but it's at this point that the Bnei Betera, the members of the Betera family, who had been leading the Sanhedrin for a number of decades now, since the death of Shamai and Avtalyon, they resign and they hand over the leadership of the Sanhedrin to Hillel, since he's clearly the greatest scholar of his day, and they make him the president of the Sanhedrin. They then make another leading scholar of the day by the name of Menachem. They make him Hillel's deputy. Menachem doesn't last very long. He leaves the Sanhedrin. What happened to him is debated in the Talmud, but Shammai is then, who is the leader of this at this time, while the Sanhedrin has now been restored, it is now, has its full membership. Nevertheless, Shammai's academy in Jerusalem, which had been functioning already now for some decades, now continues to function, though Shammai himself and the leading scholars of the school are members of the Sanhedrin as well. When Menachem leaves, Shammai gets voted in as the deputy leader of the Sanhedrin. So Hillel is the leader, Shammai becomes the deputy. But the Sanhedrin is no longer serving in its role as it always did as the central academy where issues were discussed, where Torah was learned. Because Shammai has his own academy, which is a very prominent academy. The Sanhedrin at this point becomes more of a council where they bring up issues, debate them quickly, and vote on them. But the actual study and analysis and the original issues are really being brought up already for a debate earlier in Shammai's academy and perhaps other small academies that exist at the time in Jerusalem. Hillel, feeling the need, opens his own academy in Jerusalem, and many scholars flock to his school. So now, as a result, instead of the way it had been until now, at least since the beginning of the Second Temple period, where the Sanhedrin served as an academy, essentially a school for advanced scholars, or an academy for advanced scholars, where they would study, analyze. I think today they call them think tanks, right? Places where advanced scholars sit and think. There was a school for advanced scholars where they would study, analyze alone in groups, debate in larger groups, and then eventually bring it up with the entire group for a vote, and then vote on what the law should be in a particular scenario that came up. That's what it had been. Essentially, all the major scholars were all in one place doing this together. And when issues came up, they were always voting. Now the Sanhedrin has a different role. Now the Sanhedrin is simply a council where they come together, everyone offers their opinion, and they take a vote. The way you would think of a council today. The study and analysis is not happening in the Sanhedrin anymore. Now it's happening in the yeshivas, in separate schools, in Bet Shamai and Bet Hillel, in the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, these two private schools in Jerusalem. So now these two academies, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, will remain the dominant schools from about 30 BCE. Bet Shammai seems to have opened a little bit earlier. Bet Hillel seems to have opened not long after Hillel arrived. We don't know exact years. And they seem to be dominant for the next 100 years in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin continues to meet to make decisions on legal issues, as well as keeping up the calendar, their most important role. But the study, the analysis is not taking place in the Sanhedrin anymore. It is rather taking place in the academies, particularly in the academies of Hillel and Bet Shammai, the academies of Shammai and Hillel. Any questions? Yes, Adela.
Well, when the two schools study, they don't vote anymore. They let the vote happen in the Sanhedrin.
The vote's going to happen in the Sanhedrin because you need a centralized place where where everyone votes together, and then that's going to be binding on all Jews. The Sanhedrin is the all-powerful kind of leadership of Judaism. We don't have a Sanhedrin anymore. We did a class where we spoke about Sanhedrin in much greater detail. We don't have a single body that can decide what the law should be for all Jews. We come to decisions based on consensus today. There's still a lot of debate. But when the Sanhedrin stood, there was a final body that made the rules. And they said, if there's a debate, this is the rule. And they would debate. Every major issue would come up for the debate to Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin would study it and analyze it. What changed was, instead of the studying happening all in one place, the studying and analysis was happening now in two private schools, and the Sanhedrin was just a place where they would vote on things.
Well, I guess my question then is, not everybody was privy to the study because it's happened in two places. So now they're voting, but they don't all know the research.
Yes, so this leads to a lot of problems. You're absolutely right.
It was private schools, these two schools? So
These were private schools. The Sanhedrin was a public school. How the Sanhedrin was funded is for another time, but they went through some difficult moments. We don't know who paid Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Presumably they were private and they fundraise themselves. We don't know. Yes.
Hillel, of course, so many schools are named after him. People name their kids after Hillel, but I've never heard anybody named after Shammai.
There are plenty of people named after Hillel and plenty of people named after Shammai.
Yeah.
Yes. So each of these two schools, because, as Adele pointed out, they're studying laws independently, debating laws independently, and analyzing laws independently, many differences of opinion crop up between the schools. In other words, one school reaches one consensus, and the other school reaches another consensus. And this led to the many debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. The school of Shammai and school of Hillel, as I mentioned earlier, we have 316 recorded debates between the two schools. Now, many of those 316 issues that actually came before the Sanhedrin. So in other words, the school studied it, and then when the Sanhedrin met, someone brought it up, and it was brought up to vote. And it was resolved. As a result, it was resolved. If the Sanhedrin votes, then that vote is now binding. Most of the time when the Sanhedrin voted, they voted following Bet Hillel. Because throughout this 100-year period of the two schools, Bet Hillel consistently retained a majority in the Sanhedrin. However, since they had a majority, so if there was a consensus in Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai, they would usually, when they put it up for a vote, Bet Hillel would usually win. There were a handful of times where they ruled following Bet Shammai. Likely, in each of those times, there was, remember, these are schools, not always is there necessarily a consensus in these schools. Right? Not necessarily does every member of Bet Hillel agree with the position of most of the members of Bet Hillel. So what likely happened is, although now the Sanhedrin was split into two, what you would call parties, right? Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, not always are all members of Bet Hillel going to vote with Bet Hillel. So as a result, there were times when it appears members of Bet Hillel voted along with Bet Shammai, and as a result, the ruling followed Bet Shammai. There was one time mentioned in the Mishnah in Shabbos and in Idiot and a number of places in the Talmud. There was one time when the Sanhedrin met at the home of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Gurion, who was a great sage during this late Second Temple period. And it was at this time when they had this particular meeting, Bet Shammai, when they looked around, Bet Shammai happened to have a majority in the room. And so Bet Shammai decided to, first they closed the doors and not let anyone else in. And then they voted on 18 things that they felt were really, really, really important to them. And they had a majority on each thing, and they were able to pass 18 laws in this one sitting during this one event. They were able to pass 18 laws in one after the next that, again, Bet Shammai had felt were extremely important, and in these 18 things, the halacha, the law, then follows Bet Shammai. However, most of their disputes, the vast majority of there's a few dozen that were resolved, most of their disputes never made it to a vote, as far as we know. And most of the debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel remained unresolved by the Sanhedrin, were never brought up to the Sanhedrin. Remember, when the Sanhedrin is an academy, essentially every member of the Sanhedrin is going there daily or as often as they can, right, to take part in the debates, in the study, in the analysis, in the votes. When they're each in independent schools and the Sanhedrin is only meeting really to debate and vote, then the meetings become much less frequent. As a result, they're taking much less votes. So a lot of issues do not get resolved as a result. There's also, this becomes a very difficult time during the late Second Temple period. There is, as we'll see, there's extreme violence during the late Second Temple period. There's a lot of problems in Jerusalem. And as a result, the Sanhedrin perhaps did not meet as frequently as maybe they should have. So it seems that the heydays of these two schools were in the decades that Shammai and Hillel each led their own school, which would have been in the last 30 years or so before the Common Era. And at the very, very beginning of the Common Era, we believe Hillel died around the year 10. So it was around that time when he lived a very, very long life, Hillel. And so it was around that time that, that's when the schools seem to have really, really been strongest. That's when most of the debates between the two schools erupted during this period. Over time, especially after the death of their founders, in the early years of our current counting, the school's statures diminished. And yet, most scholars during this period identified with one of these two schools. Either they were a member of Bet Shammai or they were a member of Bet Hillel. There does seem to be scholars that went back and forth between the two. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, for example, who later becomes the leader of Israel during the period of the destruction, he is associated with both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, although he seems to have primarily identified with Bet Hillel. And these schools continued for about 60 years after the deaths of Shammai and Hillel, until the destruction of the temple, although they seem to have over time diminished in prominence. And yet, despite the differences between these two schools, the scholars of these schools intermingled a lot. They were good friends. They connected a lot. There are countless accounts in the Mishnah and Talmud of discussions between members of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, including not just discussions perhaps at a debate that they had, but discussions at various social events where they bumped into each other. And so they were clearly hanging out in the same circles, right? Going to the same places. They were friends with each other. Although they debated on many issues, they were still very close. There was also a lot of intermarriage between scholarly families and students of one school with students of the other school. They married a lot. And perhaps the best example of that is Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who was one of the scholars affiliated with Bet Shammai in its final years before the destruction. He is a student and then great scholar, student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but then a great scholar in the years prior to the destruction of the temple. And he marries the daughter of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the great-grandson of Hillel, and the leader of Bet Hillel, the leader of the school of Hillel. And the president of the Sanhedrin. So here you have one of the leading scholars of Bet Shammai is married to the daughter of the president or the leader of Bet Hillel. So, and there seems to have been many, many such examples. But as the days of the temple came to a close, chaos grew in Jerusalem during these final years of the temple. The increased chaos, there were increased street battles between ever increasingly anti-Semitic Romans who were trying to rule over Israel and hated Jews and and attacked the Jews sometimes for no reason, sometimes because sometimes for a reason, and Jews that were attacking Romans in return. And there was increasing chaos and street battles between Greeks and Jews throughout the land of Israel. There were many Greeks living in Israel at the time, between Jews and Romans during this period, and especially in Jerusalem. There was ever increasing violence. And yet throughout this period, Jerusalem remains the seat of the Sanhedrin and of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. The Sanhedrin eventually, around the year 30, is forced out of the temple and moves to a different place in Jerusalem because of the violence. The temple is the center of Judaism and Jewish life, became the center of some of the violence. And so the Sanhedrin moves out. But the school Sanhedrin continues to function. Although it struggled, the schools continue to function. And this lasts until war breaks out, full-fledged war breaks out in the rebellion against the Romans around the year 66. 66 or 67. That war lasts for a couple years. It ends with the siege of Jerusalem and the absolute destruction of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple. The scholars that managed to survive the war, managed to escape Jerusalem before its fall, they reconvene after the war is over. They reconvene in the city of Yavne, which already had a yeshiva, and over there they rebuild the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, once again, is not only a council, but becomes an academy. It's an academy with hundreds of elite scholars studying, debating, legislating. In fact, the Sanhedrin in Yavne becomes a very, very important academy and Sanhedrin because it's time to make major adjustments to Judaism and Jewish life with the destruction of the temple. Prayers have to be rewritten. Instead of praying for God to preserve the temple, we have to pray to... Instead of praying to preserve the temple, we have to pray to restore the temple. Instead of praying to preserve Jerusalem, we have to pray to restore Jerusalem. Many laws that involve the temple have to be adjusted to fit the new reality, right? Many new rules are made to remember the temple and mourn for the temple. All of these major changes are done at Yavne by the Sanhedrin in Yavne. Again, the Sanhedrin has, as the Supreme Council of Judaism, don't have the power to change the 613 commandments, but they can legislate new laws, they can interpret new laws, they can apply laws to a new reality, right? We don't have a Sanhedrin today that could do something like that, but the Sanhedrin in Yavne do that. Among the issues that are raised by the members of the Sanhedrin in Yavne, now remember, these elite scholars, most of them had previously studied in Jerusalem. Most of them were previously either members of Bet Shammai or Bet Hillel, because most scholars in Jerusalem identified with one of the two schools. So one of the issues that they want to do in Yavne is resolve the countless unresolved debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. The Talmud tells us that for 3 years, the scholars in Yavne debated as to what they should do about all those unresolved debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. And then it says that a voice from heaven announced one day while they were debating that Elo ve'elo divrei Elokim Chayim, both these and these, the words of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, are the words of the living God. In other words, both of them are correct. However, the halacha should follow Bet Hillel, and it appears that after this revelation from the Sanhedrin took a vote and decided that on all unresolved issues between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, we will follow Bet Hillel. So they kind of did it all in one go. Those hundreds of issues that had been debated were all resolved in one go, that we follow Bet Hillel for everything. And from then on, the halacha follows Bet Hillel for all issues, except for things that had been decided previously. Some things had been voted on by the Sanhedrin, and some of those followed Bet Shammai. Except for those, for everything else, the halacha follows Bet Hillel. And that is the way it remains, of course, today. There were sometimes debates in Yavne as to what Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel said. Remember, they are maybe decades after some of the debates took place, and people remember different things. So one person said, no, Bet Shammai said this. Another person said, Bet Hillel said that. And another one said, no, Bet Shammai said this, and Bet Hillel said that. So they sometimes do get into debates over what Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel actually did say. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question. Okay, when you first started talking about the Sanhedrin, you said, okay, I can't remember if you said it was the Romans or somebody else that caused the central Sanhedrin to disband. They didn't care if they studied on their own, but they just didn't want the centralized group. So
correct. The Romans caused the Sanhedrin to disband,
right.
Didn't care if they studied on their own, but did not want the central
right.
power.
I caught that. But what I didn't get is what enabled them to come back and be a centralized body again with full body.
That's a very good question. What enabled them to come back as a centralized body? It's not clear what enabled them to come back. It probably was the Romans were less concerned, and it happened organically. In other words, it probably never happened we officially now allow you to have a Sanhedrin. Remember, there was a Sanhedrin continually, a rump Sanhedrin that was deciding calendar. And so there were members of the Sanhedrin. There was a Sanhedrin. There was a group, meeting. But it wasn't officially sanctioned. With time, it presumably organically returned. Yes?
Do we know where Yavne was located?
I don't think so.
No.
We don't know where Yavne. I don't believe we know where Yavne was located. I don't think we know where it is. Yes.
So now is the best din like the Sanhedrin?
Is a Beth Din today like a Sanhedrin? The answer is no. We did a class on a Sanhedrin previously, but no one has the authority the Sanhedrin once had. So in almost all debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai take the stricter view and Bet Hillel take the more lenient view. There are countless exceptions, of course, and there's even a section in the Mishnah and Idiot where it lists the laws where Bet Shammai is more lenient and Bet Hillel is stricter. And yet, generally, Bet Shammai takes the stricter view, and Bet Hillel takes the more lenient view. Bet Shammai are generally seen as more demanding, less compromising in Jewish law, while Bet Hillel are generally seen as looser and more compromising. Now, to be clear, when the scholars of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel are debating an issue in halacha, in Jewish law, they're not debating about how they feel about the issue. I think this should be okay, or I don't think this should be okay. That's not how they did it, right? To be clear, in almost most of the laws of that Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel debate, the Talmud will analyze the reasoning behind those laws. Almost always it's a debate over how to correctly interpret a source in Scripture or how to correctly interpret a particular earlier law. So it's not just debates of how they felt like. Each opinion has a complex analysis that leads to their conclusion. And each time, the Talmud will always explain the stages of the analysis that led each school to its particular conclusion. There's a reason for it. It's not just random. It's not just they felt like it. But nevertheless, despite the fact that each side has arguments to back up their views in virtually every case that we know of, yet there's clearly a certain bias between the two sides, where Bet Shammai have a bias of being stricter, and Bet Hillel seem to have a bias of being more lenient. In Kabbalah and Chassidus, it explains that Bet Shammai, their souls were from what we call Gvura, the side of judgment. Bet Hillel, their souls were from the side of kindness. And therefore, they had a bias. And the truth is that everyone has a particular bias. Everyone has it. Some people are more forgiving and compromising. Some people are stricter and more demanding. Everyone has particular biases. People who were stricter and more demanding gravitated towards Bet Shammai, the school of Shammai, because that was the kind of school and the scholars that was the personality of the scholars that were there. People who were more lenient and forgiving would gravitate towards Bet Hillel, so they had a bias and they tended to come up with these opinions. But again, each of the viewpoints have a very strong and analytical source. They're not just they felt like it, but there's always the Talmud will bring scriptural sources and how they interpret, how each side interprets the verse, and why each one did it their way, and they disagree with the other way of interpreting it. And Talmud usually go into quite great detail to explain the reasoning for each one. Now, I'm just going to finish off and take questions in a few minutes because we're over time. Now, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers in the late 19th century was Rav Yosef Engel of Warsaw. And he was a very original, very creative thinker. And in one of his works, Beit Otzar, he shows that many of the debates between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel can actually be boiled down to a theoretical debate of what is more important, the potential or the actual, the theoretical or the reality. And he gives countless examples. But this is actually visible, very visible, in their debate over the Hanukkah lights. With Bet Shammai, we began by saying Bet Shammai say that on the first night of Hanukkah you light 8 lights. The second night of Hanukkah you light 7. The next night you light 6, and every single night you light 1 less. And we actually do something similar, they point out, when we offer when we offer sacrifices on Sukkot, where each day of Sukkot we offer less sacrifices. And there's a connection between Hanukkah and Sukkot. I don't want to get into all the details of the reasoning behind them. Bet Hillel says that we start with 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. Every night you're adding 1 till the last night you light 8. And that's based on a rule, Ma'alim B'Kodesh, that you always go up. In holiness, you always want to increase. So, and why each one believes in their particular view is discussed and debated. But Rav Yosef Engel points out, Bet Shammai, they are looking at how many days are left in Hanukkah. The first night, there are 8 days to go. The second, you light 8 candles. The second night, there are 7 days to go. The third night, there are 6 days to go. They're looking at the potential, how many days there are to go. While Bet Hillel are looking at how many days have passed. The first night, it's day 1. 1 day has passed. Second night, it's day 2. 2 nights have passed. Here, they're looking at the actual, at the reality. How many have actually passed? Another example that he gives is there is a debate. We know that the new year for trees is on the 15th of Shvat. But there's actually a debate between Bet Shamai and Bet Hillel. Bet Shamai say the new year for trees should be on the 1st of the month of Shvat. While Bet Hillel say the new year for trees should be on the 15th of Shvat. Of course, we follow Bet Hillel because in everything we always rule following Bet Hillel. But what is the reasoning for the debate? So the Jerusalem Talmud explains that the new year for trees begins 4 months after the regular New Year. Regular New Year, Rosh Hashanah. Right? Why? Because it takes 4 months for trees to, when you water trees, when they start getting their water, it takes 4 months for them to actually begin to grow. The technicals of that I don't know, but that's what the Talmud says. So it's 4 months after our New Year. Now, when is our New Year? Well, we know our New Year is Rosh Hashanah. That is when we are judged, and that is when Hashem decides what kind of year He's going to give us. 4 months later, says Bet Shammai, 1st of Shvat is the New Year for trees. But Bet Hillel says no. It's while the New Year is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the rain season begins when? On Sukkot, the 15th of the month. 4 months later is the 15th of Shvat. So Bet Shammai look at the beginning of the year when essentially we are judged, not when the rain actually begins, not when the rain season begins, but 4 months from the beginning of the year when we are at least theoretically judged whether there will be rain and how much rain we will get. They're looking at the potential, 4 months from the potential. While Bet Hillel are looking at the actual 4 months when the rain season actually starts on the 15th day of the month of Tishrei. 4 months later will be the 15th day of the month of Shvat. And he brings many examples as to where we see this. Later scholars have taken this to, have expanded on this and shown countless disagreements between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel that all fit in the same logic. There are other explanations given for the differences between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, but not for now. But perhaps the most important of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel's legacy is they really the beginning of debate in Judaism. Prior to Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, there was no debate in Judaism. Not that we didn't debate things, we certainly debated things. But any issue that was debated by local scholars, if we didn't know the answer, or then we would go back, send a message to the Sanhedrin and say, what's the law in this particular case? We think the law is like this, we think the law is like that. And the Sanhedrin would take up the issue, and they would then debate it and analyze it and study it in this academy that they had with the Sanhedrin. And then at the end, they would take a vote. And now we know the answer. The Sanhedrin voted on it, right? It's been resolved. So any issue that came up for debate was essentially resolved. When Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel were really the first time that schools were opened independent of the Sanhedrin. Where leading scholars were debating issues outside of the Sanhedrin.